Well, it was Tuesday night, actually, that Newsnight screened an entire episode discussing Syria. And Sir Malcolm Rifkind was putting the case for arming the rebels. He is the chairman of the supposedly unbiased Intelligence and Security Committee, who we've criticised several times on this programme, particularly because of the links of Sir Malcolm Rifkind to defence companies and the fact that he's a director of one of those advisors to defence companies. So clearly there is defence money coming into his pocket, as well as others on that committee being slightly questionable, including one of them who wrote a report on the Iraq War, which seemed to really not get in any way to the bottom of finding out about this business of weapons of mass destruction. The Butler report, that's what it was. Martin, when I saw that, I thought it would be really nice to have Martin in the studio arguing with Sir Malcolm Rifkind and putting a few points to him, so I'm going to give you the chance to do that now. And so here is Malcolm Rifkind from Tuesday night's Newsnight, putting the case for arming the Syrian rebels.
Thank you. The question of whether we give help to the moderate secular Syrian opposition is one of the most difficult decisions we will be asked to reach. There are good arguments on both sides of the question. Like most people, I began, when this war began, hoping it would be a civil war, that the outside world would not have to intervene. I was against the Iraq war. I don't normally support intervention in other people's countries. But as we have seen, intervention has already been happening over the last 2 years. Russian and Iranian arms have flown in to help the Assad regime. Hezbollah troops are fighting with the Assad regime against the Syrian people. So it's against that background that we now have to address that question.
Well, I think that's just basically misinterpreting the situation. He says it's complicated. You've got Hezbollah troops, of course, who are Shia, like most of the leadership in Syria. You've got the Iraqi elected government supporting Assad. Morsi was removed last week in Egypt because the Egyptian army refused to get involved in fighting in Syria. I think Malcolm Rifkind should stick to his own rules and say, let's not interfere in other people's business.
And it's not, as you have heard, about sending an army into Syria. It's also not a question of whether Britain by itself takes action. We are part of an international community. There are already over 100 countries, more than half the United Nations, that have recognized the Syrian opposition as the legitimate voice of the Syrian people. And that includes most of the countries of the Arab League. So it's whether the international community should intervene. And I believe that it is both ethically justified as well as politically desirable. And basically 2 reasons. First of all, the humanitarian reason. Already over 100,000 men, women and children have been killed, mostly because of a brutal onslaught by the Assad regime against its own people. The more this war continues, the more likely we are to see not 100,000 but 200,000 a year from now. And even if Assad takes Homs, that will still be a very long war.
Well, I mean, in Iraq, people have been dying every day as well. But we're not talking about that because the regime in Iraq, the Maliki regime, supports Assad, even though they won the democratic election, if there was a democratic election in Iraq. And it's not a question of just having dictators who are removed by popular force. What you've actually got is a very complicated situation. Lots of different factions involved. Hezbollah, he mentioned them earlier, they are in control of the government of Lebanon with their Christian allies. And in actual fact, they are moving into Syria to protect their villages, which are mostly Shia, from the Sunni rebels. And lots of people have died in Syria. Many of them have been killed by the regime. I wouldn't doubt that for a minute. But many of them have been killed by the rebels. And there isn't actually good guys and bad guys here. And the other thing I would point out, that in actual fact, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and it's been reported in the British press that British special forces have already been inside Syria. People have got to realise that we're already engaged. In the Middle East, Britain and the US and countries like that are not seen as kind of passive, neutral countries. They're seen as the enemy. And eventually, of course, we will be treated as the enemy because we are.
The second reason is that the war will only come to an end when both sides recognise that there has to be a political solution, that no side can win entirely on military grounds. And that will only happen, it's my final point, that will only happen when Assad recognises that he has to agree to a new transitional government.
Okay.
At the moment, he has no incentive to make any such concession.
Well, this is really interesting, isn't it? Because in actual fact, the Russians have been pushing exactly this line from the very beginning. Let's get everybody around the table, like in Bosnia or anywhere else, and have a negotiated solution. And the sticking point has always been that the rebels will not negotiate with Assad, and therefore he's got to step down before we can have a transitional regime. Now, Assad is turning around and saying, look, my army are winning on the ground. You are not in a position to tell me I cannot be part of the negotiation. I'm happy to negotiate. I'm coming to Geneva. You know who's not going to turn up in Geneva? The rebels, because they're losing. And if they come to Geneva, the deal they'll get won't satisfy them. So they're saying we don't want to talk. So when Rifkind says we've got to have a political solution, what political solution when you don't want to include Assad and his army who are winning the war?
Well, one of the key questions which Sir Malcolm Rifkind had to respond to was whether or not the whole thing would be legal. Would it actually be a violation of international law to arm these rebels?
A question about the level of risk we accept that the weapons might end up in the wrong hands. Now, of course, you can't give 100% guarantees, but think logically. The only people who don't have weapons at the moment are the Free Syrian Army. The jihadis already have them. Assad already has them. Why should the Free Syrian Army, if it at long last gets weapons, why should it wish to hand them over to people who have already got them and who are their own sworn enemies in the terms of the long-term future of Syria?
Well, I mean, this idea of the moderate rebels, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Western powers, I mentioned Roland Dumas earlier, who used to be French foreign minister, he said there was a plan to try and set up an insurgency inside Syria and Libya before any protests took place. So it's totally disingenuous of Sir Malcolm Rifkind to come out and say, and there's also something unreal about this. We're talking about whether we should supply weaponry. And he just says the Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra front have got loads of weaponry. Where do you think they got it from? I think they got it from the Turks, from the Qataris and the Saudis, who are our allies. Incidentally, when are we starting the armed struggle against the medieval regime in Saudi Arabia? Because the message is absolutely clear, isn't it? There's one thing, what we've got to do, the people in Egypt have got to do to get rid of the army, they need to start fighting the army, and then the RAF will come in and bomb those Egyptian tanks for them, as we did in Libya, and then we'll have a popular revolution in Egypt. A few people will die, but just like in Syria, in the end, we will have a pro-Western democratic regime. But first of all, the army has to be smashed. The Free Syrian Army, the Free Egyptian Army, the Free Bahraini Army, let's get the guns out. It's just nuts. The Russians are saying, if you arm the Syrian rebels, we will carry on, and the Iranians were saying, we will carry on arming Assad, and it could end up with your soldiers, Russian soldiers, fighting British soldiers. Fantastic.
While we had a European arms embargo, or if there was a United Nations arms embargo, that clearly would make it improper to provide arms. But the idea that because Assad, according to the Russians, is still the government of Syria, well, that may be the Russians' view, but I mentioned earlier, over 100 countries of the United Nations have said they recognize the Syrian opposition as the legitimate spokesman of the Syrian people, and even the Arab League has expelled Assad and has invited the Syrian opposition to take the Syrian seat in the Arab League. So who is the legal government and who are the rebels?
That's an interesting question. Who is the Arab League? Oh, it's Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, all these countries where they don't have any elections at all. They're the Arab League. And of course, the neighbours of Syria, that is Lebanon and Iraq, are fairly clearly supporting Assad for sectarian reasons, because the Christians and the Shiites and the Alawites and the secular people do not want to see a Sunni-led regime in Damascus, any more than the people in Egypt wanted to see Morsi running it and all the rest of it. This is far, far more complicated than he imagines, and it's not just about Syria. The Chinese and the Russians are getting fed up of the Western approach to everything, which is let's have a war, let's have a war, let's have a war. And let's not forget that all of this is ultimately about Iran, and we've got to stop the Iranians getting nuclear weapons, otherwise goodness knows what might happen. In fact, if the Iranians had nuclear weapons, it would do nothing at all apart from calm the situation down. And ultimately, this is pouring petrol on a fire. And Sir Malcolm Rifkind is way out of line with British public opinion, which doesn't know much about these things we're talking about, but certainly doesn't want to get involved. And people who know what's going on want to get involved even less. This whole idea that the West has got a duty to fix the politics of the Middle East is absurd. If we want to fix the politics of the Middle East, the first thing you can do is make the Israelis withdraw behind the Green Line, insist that the Bahrainis have a democratic election. If they don't have a democratic election, then we've got to go to war, just like in Syria, because if we don't get democratic elections and they're torturing and killing people, well, at certain points, pacifism doesn't do, does it? It doesn't do in Syria, it doesn't do in Bahrain, it doesn't do in Israel, it doesn't do anywhere. Everybody got to get up and fight for their rights. Absolutely, Mr. Rifkind, we're right for it. And when the Bahrainis plant a bomb outside your house because you're killing their people and they think you're to blame, you will say, great, fantastic. Because, we're all in favour of fights and wars, and that's the business, isn't it? Sometimes we've just got to walk the talk and plant the bombs and shoot everybody, haven't we?
Well, Martin, one of the most important points that he's trying to make there was about the legalities of it, which was to do with the EU arms embargo. Now, what he's saying is now the EU arms embargo is no more. It was a couple of weeks ago. There is no more of an embargo. Then that means that it's fine under international law to supply weapons to the Syrian
in actual
rebels.
fact, the only people who wanted to lift the arms embargo were the British and the French. All of the other members of the EU were not at all happy about the idea, especially the Germans. The Germans were saying this is nuts. But they were overruled. No doubt they were told that various things to do with trade or whatever wouldn't go through unless they agreed to allow the British. And then the British and the French said, we want to lift the arms embargo, but we don't actually want to do anything yet because we haven't agreed what to do, which is absolutely stupid because the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrian regime just interpret this as, grandstanding. Basically, on the ground, the position is absolutely clear. The Syrian army is winning, and that's all there is to it.
PCFM 93.2.
Well, on a related topic, we've finally seen the deportation of Abu Qatada this week. So let's go to the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, who gave her view, supposedly an opposition view, on the deportation of Abu Qatada.
The entire House should strongly welcome the work that the Home Secretary and her junior minister have done to get Abu Qatada finally on a plane back to Jordan to stand fair trial. This is a good result, not just for the Home Secretary, but for the country. In his home country, Abu Qatada stands accused of plotting terror attacks against a school and against tourists. It is right he should stand trial for those offences and for justice to be done.
Now, this is supposedly an opposition view, Martin. What are your thoughts about the way that Abu Qatada has been held here in this country and now has been sent to Jordan?
Well, let's talk about Jordan. They don't have democratic elections in Jordan any more than they do in Syria. And if they did have democratic elections, people like Abu Qatada might win. So we're sending him back to be put on trial by a non-democratic regime, which we support. And, of course, he's exactly the kind of person who in Syria we're calling a freedom fighter. Can't people see how ridiculous this has all become? What's going on here is neo-imperialist 19th century politics and scaremongering of the worst kind. Abu Qatada claims he's innocent. Even if he wasn't innocent and he was a terrorist in terms of the state in Jordan, Jordan is not a democratic state. Hey, wake up! In Syria, when you haven't got a democratic state, we say it's great for the Free Syrian Army to start fighting back. Abu Qatada was fighting back. We should give him a medal. Give him a rifle. Never mind sending him back. Look, see how illogical all of this has become.
Do you think maybe he might skip jail, skip over the border and start fighting in Syria with Al Qaeda?
Well, who knows? He's in Jordanian custody now, no doubt potentially torturable. As we all, the Jordanian regime is not a democratic regime any more than the Saudi regime is, the Bahraini regime, or any of the other regimes which we sell so much weaponry to. Now, if we're going to have a rule that says if there's a non-democratic regime, an armed uprising against it is justifiable, and remember, don't forget when Gaddafi died, what Hillary Clinton said was, we saw he died, and she was laughing about the fact that he died on video with a bayonet up his backside. And in fact, the evidence suggests it was actually French special forces who did the assassination. Now, if people want to think that that's a good way to carry on politics, that's fine. But no crying for mummies when it really gets going. No crying for mummies, we're not interested.
Drive Time on BCFM 93.2.